Hello, I'm Sandeep Tyagi, your host for the brand called You. The brand we are speaking to today is Vivek Jetley. Vivek is EVP at EXL Service, a NASDAQ listed company and a leader in the space of analytics. Has built a big business in that space. You'll be talking about that. He's educated at University of Mumbai and I am Calcutta. Welcome to the podcast, Vivek.
Hi, Sandeep. Very glad to be here.
Well, first off, you lead a big analytics business at EXL. That means different things to different people. Tell us more about the business. What is it? How many people? What kind of an impact is it creating in the world?
So first of all, I think in full disclosure, I should talk about the fact that the business I lead is actually grown up from the business, Sandeep, that you founded and that we were all a part of at Inductus.
Right.
I joined Inductus a short while after Sandeep founded the company in the early 2000s. And it was my privilege to be part of Sandeep's team as we grew up that business. Sandeep decided, and all of us together decided to kind of sell the business to EXL in 2006. And that's when I think EXL Analytics got formed. And a few years after that, I got the opportunity to be part of the leadership team for EXL Analytics. So what we've done is, in a lot of ways, we've built upon the vision that we had at that point in time, which was effectively use data and the insights that you can create from the data to start producing business outcomes. And I think in certain cases, the mission remains the same, at that level even today. What we are in the business of today is basically helping our clients becoming more data-led in their decisioning across all aspects of what they do, across all functions. And being data-led in this case means focusing more on the type of data that you're using for your decisions, creating more predictive insights based on that data, and then having the ability of taking those insights and putting them into your workflows to be able to generate business outcomes. If I think about the value that we add to our customers today, it really comes down to greater speed to insights and faster speed of outcomes. And those are really the currency that we speak in. Now, the business is, as you can imagine, in this day and age of data science, the business has grown tremendously. So we are today more than 8,000 plus data scientists, analysts, and engineers spread the world over. We've got offices in multiple continents. The US, India, and Europe are three of our largest markets for us today. And from a group of people that was focused just on financial services, today we've got 150 plus customers in diverse industries, including banking and financial services, insurance, healthcare, retail, media, CPG, and what have you. So it's become a really massive business. It's gratifying sometimes to see how far we've come and how quickly.
Anytime you're riding a rocket which has been growing, I think compounded at certainly over 30% from what I've seen, it is fantastic. And congratulations on building.
You're right. We have been fortunate because we did this analysis for our board, and the compounded growth rate was in excess of 30%. So whenever you see something like that, you realize that what you've got is pretty special.
Very special. 8,000 people, that's fantastic. That's a lot of brain work. Now, I keep hearing that large language models, ChatGPT, is going to replace a lot of analytics because you could just type your question in ChatGPT and it'll tell you. What do you see happening? I know you're doing a lot of work in this generative AI space. How do you see it working with a human analytics expert, and what kind of problems it will solve and what kinds of problems it won't solve?
Got it. So first of all, I think there's been a ton of hype about generative AI, right? And you have had these reports that came out which said, look, this is going to fundamentally change the nature of work, and it's fundamentally going to alter the way we interact in our professional lives. And you had the trillions of numbers of impact thrown around by everyone saying, here's the amount of GDP impact it's going to create. And as is always the case, there's a lot of hype when something this transformative comes in. There's a lot of people that kind of start talking about, here's the big number that they're going to put out there. My experience has been that those numbers always tend to be very optimistic, over optimistic in the short term. And then only for truly transformative technologies, and you could count the internet revolution as one of them, only for truly transformative technologies do those numbers actually get hit in the long term. Now, I personally believe that generative AI is going to be one of those transformative technologies. But the impact of that is not going to be these trillions of dollars right away. It's going to take a long time before we start getting to, it becoming pervasive in what we do. Now, to kind of get back to your question of saying, how does it change the nature of the work that is going to happen? I think from the analytics perspective, it's actually going to be a tailwind. So what the way we think about it is, yes, there are going to be some aspects of what we used to do, like business intelligence, building out dashboards, that are probably going to go away, or the usage of that is going to reduce, because people will find better ways of accessing information, and generative AI does a great job at being able to parse through information to kind of, bring it in a digestible format, and that capability is going to cut into the work that's on building prefabricated dashboards. However, the amount of new work that gets created with generative AI is probably going to outweigh that. And the reason I say that is the biggest value from generative AI right now is going to come from unstructured data. And guess what? The last few years, most of the investments that have gone into data have been on the structured side. So now you've got to create a whole new data repository, a whole new archive of data that focuses on unstructured data. You're looking at databases that now need to be vector databases as opposed to structured relational databases. You're looking at things where you've got to build out, a RAG kind of a framework in terms of getting the LLM to hit against it and bring information from where you want it. So all of that work actually will create more of a tailwind in terms of demand for data scientists. The nature of what a data scientist was going to do is probably going to change. You're not going to write as much code as they used to earlier. And some of those old coding platforms, their prevalence is going to become lower. But at the end of the day, the focus on how do I take data, parse it, create insights, and then make those insights work for me in a business context, that flow remains the same even with LLMs. The toolkit changes. And I think that's the way, at least early on, that's what we are seeing. We are actually seeing a step up in demand because of this, rather than a cannibalization of demand.
So let's talk about the hype versus the reality. 150 clients, global footprint. How many of them would you say are experimenting with it? How many have implemented something, and how many have not even started?
So first of all, 100% of them, every single client of mine that I've talked to, and as you can imagine, at this time of year, you're kind of doing, you're doing the rounds with the clients. You're trying to find out about the budgets for next year. Every single one of them is thinking about, well, what is generative AI going to do for me? Now, the vast majority of those tend to be in the experimentation phase. And even within experiments, there's probably two layers of experiment. One layer of experiment is, you know what, I've set up a ChatGPT API, and my team's pinging that API, and look, we are doing extraction of data. You've not really thought about what's the business use case behind it. You're just doing the technology proof of concept, so to speak. Right? So that's how most companies started early in 23. I think right now, most companies have progressed to the next level of experimentation. And the next level of experimentation is they've done the work in terms of thinking about use cases. And at this point in time, they're actually in the testing out phase of those use cases. So they've done the work in terms of saying, okay, what LLM should I choose? What's the business process that I'm going to start impacting? Let me start seeing whether this is going to be of a benefit or not. And these experiments that they're running are going to have an implication in 24, where they say some of these are going to become at scale. And this tends to be the largest group at this point. The smallest group is the one on top, which has actually already finished some of those experiments. They've identified a couple of use cases that they want to progress. And they're already looking at saying, okay, what do I do with scale? How do I take this into productionalization? And what do I do with adoption? So for us, the bulk of our client set right now is in that middle bucket, where they are in the experimentation stage, but doing at the use case level rather than just at the test level.
Tech moving from tech stack to business use cases, right?
Business use cases.
What's the poster child? What do you like pull out of your deck to say, here is a case study, here is an impact that somebody has been able to actually create in a business process? What does that look like?
There's a couple of different things that we talk about, and these are kind of almost emerging as the conversation pieces with most of our clients. Number one is productivity enhancement. So the fundamental thing that generative AI does is for a knowledge worker, it has the ability of taking up the productivity and almost bridging this, I guess, the experience gap. Let me illustrate that with an example. So we are talking to a client about what we are calling an agent assist. Now, an agent assist is, as it sounds like, it's helping someone do a conversation with a customer. That agent needed to be trained. That agent needed to understand what the processes were, what the policies were. And that was both from structured training as well as experiential training that they would get over a period of time. So for you to have an agent that was performing at the 95th percentile, you would expect they would have spent a couple of years in it, and they would have gone through all of this training material. Generative AI has the ability to say, I can take someone who's got a 10th of that experience and basic familiarity with the concept, but I can take their level up to that 95th percentile. Now that is, it's fantastic in terms of the promise that it delivers, because especially after the pandemic, that world has gone through a lot of transformation, attrition's hit it. And here's a technology that basically says, I can help you make the calls more effective, shorter, and I can help you bridge the gap in terms of this talent pool that you weren't able to create or weren't able to tap. So it really
this pipeline, sorry to interrupt, but is this pipeline doing the whole, meaning listening to the person, understanding what they are saying in voice, and then giving back voice? Or is this somebody typing into an interface a question, getting back an answer, and then conveying it the way they want? Because these are two very different pipelines, with the heart being the same, that an LLM is taking a question and giving an answer.
The one that we are finding the biggest ahas come from the former, where what you're doing is you're actively listening to the call, and you're actually during the call, it's almost like you're having a trainer sit next to you. During the call, the trainer's giving you these gentle nudges about saying, this is something you want to say right now. Or, this question that's just been asked, here are 3 possible answers, and you should pick one of them. So the real-time aspect of it is what's really different. We could have done this in the old world, but we would have done it in a static model format.
If then else model.
And that static model, the efficacy of that model would be highest on day 1, and then it would keep dropping because of edge cases. Now with adaptive learning, you have the ability of actually saying my model efficacy is going to go the other way. And to me, that's really transformative in terms of the new technology.
Yeah. So there are 2 challenges, one of hallucination and the other of I guess let's call it localized training. For a question, there may be an answer that one company wants to give one way, whereas the internet may give it completely different way. So what do you have to say about the problem of hallucination? Will it ever go away? And what do you have to say about the narrowing the training or focusing the training with local data?
Let me tackle both of them. So the first one with hallucinations, it's a real problem, right? And it is one that, as of right now, is only the best you can do with it is minimize it, as opposed to completely eliminate it. And what we are finding is that the minimization of the problem can actually become very effective if you do just some simple things in terms of putting limits on prompts, making sure that certain prompts are created in certain ways versus the others. So just by trying to limit the way that a human interacts with the algorithm, you can actually start limiting the instances of hallucination. But mathematically, you're not at this point eliminating it, because the gain function of the algorithm is still to try and come up with an answer. Unless you fundamentally go down to the bones of it and start changing it, that's not something that has been done yet. On the second part, the localized training, that's where I think we've already come up with various solutions. And the biggest solution, I think the problem, the way you described it is, if I'm asking for the capital of India as New Delhi, but my localized document says it's Delhi, or even some other answer, I should be giving the answer that's in the localized document as opposed to what's in the general domain knowledge. And I think that's where we've been able to kind of get to just architecturally forcing the LLM only to look in that particular area. And we're kind of creating RAG frameworks, which is basically retrieval augmented generation, to say, please only generate the answer from this body of knowledge or this corpus of knowledge. So that's one portion of it. The other portion is, and this goes back to old data science, we are basically creating metadata on the data that exists here and teaching the algorithm the definitions of what we mean. So in a bank's context, we're teaching it financial terms through metadata and saying that's what you've got to learn, and forcing it to then use that kind of a
The problem that I see is that you want a large language model. That is the innovation, because use of language can't be taught by company-specific data. It's just not vast enough. So I want the language, the ability to understand and speak from the internet or a large data set. But I want the information, the facts that I'm pulling out and putting in that language to be local.
Absolutely.
How do you marry that?
So you're actually trying to split it up into two different things, right? And I think with LLMs, you've got two very important capabilities that you're tapping into. One capability is the ability to go through unstructured data and understand the context from the unstructured data. And it's phenomenal. It's, we've always had extraction toolkits, nothing of the kind of power that we have today. And the ability to extract context is quite frankly, a step above where it used to be. And all our clients and the companies that we're working with right now are actually trying to tap into that, of saying, I want the ability of looking at a large number of documents, large number of unstructured data streams, and tapping out the context from it. And I'm going to use an LLM for it. The second part of it, which is the conversational part, I think that's where they're putting the limits, because all the challenges that are happening with hallucinations and so on happen in that part. And that's where you're trying to almost put a rigor to it on saying, look, at the end of the day, even if I just spit out some text, simple text, I wanted, I don't want to use flowery language. I don't want to, for the LLM to write poetry. All I need to do is spit out the data that I've just been able to retrieve. And
So
I
you're
think that's
using
where
it
we're trying
as
to do that balance between how to use it.
Okay, understood. What do you have to say about taking a fresh graduate from one of the engineering schools and making them into somebody who could actually add value in a business world with a use case? What does that journey take these days with the complexity that is there with the tools and size of data sets and types of problems? How long is that journey, and is there any way that you have made them more effective than like you're talking about customer service reps?
So there are, there's multiple aspects to how someone trains an analyst, or how do you get trained to be a data scientist or an analytics professional. And those elements used to have a technical proficiency element to it, of saying, I want to learn the languages, I want to learn how data is stored, I want to learn coding. Then there was a core data science or a statistical knowledge, of saying you have to be trained on how do you work with data, how do you draw inferences, what's the basics of statistical analysis. And then there was a third element on it, which was business problem solving, saying you have to understand the industry, you have to understand what you're solving for, what's the right answer, what's not, how do you kind of understand the business domain. Now, in this new world, that technical proficiency part is actually becoming faster and easier to kind of grasp, because you've got all kinds of code generators. Even before generative AI, the coding ability had become more and more point and click. So the barrier to entry there of saying I have to learn a new language doesn't exist anymore. The statistical analysis is still something that is very important. In fact, it's something that most people ignore, but that's where mistakes get made, because you fundamentally make a flawed inference. But that's also where we have experts within the model who can actually start training you, start supervising. Our quality approval process goes through there. I think the third part, which is the business understanding and understanding how a business works, that I think still comes from experience. That's the part that I think is the toughest to kind of learn. And, I think for us, that's the part that we tell everyone of saying there's no substitute for actually working on problems, rolling up your sleeves and getting into the guts of a problem solving for you to be able to pick that up. It's
Nothing like battle scars to become
you've
battle
done that
hardened.
late at night, unless you've kind of done something wrong and someone tell you why that's wrong, you have no replacement for that.
Okay, well, let's change gears to your personal journey. You're a tall guy, big in the industry of analytics. What was the childhood like? Where did you grow up? What did your parents do? What kind of an environment was your childhood spent in?
So I grew up in India. I was a defense forces kid. My father was in the Indian Navy. So life for me in India was very interesting. It was living on a naval base where I would move every 3 years. So every 3 years we would pack everything up and move. But also, as I realize now, everyone in my school was moving every 3 years. So you had to constantly live with change, because every year that you start a new school year, that a third of your class is going to be different. And every 3 years, the entire class is going to be different because you moved somewhere else. It was a great childhood in hindsight, because it actually exposes you to just being able to adapt, in new social situations, to be able to get on with people from a very, very diverse background. There was no local aspect of it. Everywhere we went, you had people from all over India, and that's what you were interacting with every single time.
Very interesting. Well, what's a piece of advice that somebody gave you which has had a big impact on your journey?
So I think several things stand out for me. I think the consulting experience that I got in Mitchell Madison and then with you at Inductus, I still find that even today when I'm writing decks, some of those things still are there. Deck writing still remains exactly the same way. I think later on, from within EXL, I think I was very fortunate to work with both our founders, Rohit and with Vikram, and then a very long stint with Pawan Bagai, who was our chief operating officer. And I think what his focus on how to go about building a business for the long term, and how to kind of stay true to certain values of what you're building and not kind of lose focus of that. I think that was a very instructive lesson for me.
Okay. They say there are no failures, only lessons. What has been your biggest lesson and what caused it?
So outside of my investing lessons, which I think I'll talk to you at a later date, I think the lessons have been in terms of, how should you think about risk taking? And how do you kind of step into what's the right level of risk versus what's not? I think when I joined you at Inductus, when Inductus was still starting off, in my mind, I was joining a consulting firm. Now, when I look back, it was a startup, right? And our frames of reference were very, very different those days. We were trying to run it as a consulting firm, whereas what the industry that we were in probably needed a startup and a startup mentality. So I think if I had a do-over, I would probably go back to that time frame and say, this is the best time in your life to take risk. And how do you take risk and what do you do with that?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's something to remember, because we always will come up with opportunities in different times in our lives where we kind of know that this is something that can be big. With hindsight, it's very easy to call the flow, but at different times, when faced with those things, you have to take the plunge. So yeah, that's a good one. What's your favorite book? And what do you get out of it?
So this is a tough question because I grew up as a very voracious reader. I used to consume all kinds of things, from various different genres. But the two genres that I kind of really grabbed onto that still stay with me today was history. I'm a very avid reader of history books. And then at some point, just this big thing in science fiction. From all fiction genres, that's the one that really appeals to me. So, I mean, it's a very long list of things, but those are the two genres that stand out.
No book stands out?
If I had to pick one, actually, formatively, Cosmos by Carl Sagan. It was more a point in my life when I got to it, and it just sparked off an interest in science.
Have you read The Three-Body Problem?
I haven't.
Well, if you're a science fiction fan, that's the latest. You'll enjoy it. It's a Chinese writer. So pretty remarkable. It's a series, remarkable book. What's a cause that you're passionate about? Something that you want to change in the world?
This is a very interesting question, and one I've spent a little bit of time thinking about. So for me, there's lots of causes in the world, but the one that speaks most personally to me is really about the importance of STEM education and the importance of making sure that the generation that we are raising, our children, get access to of the kind of training that some of us got in our lifetimes. And I think it's a very counterintuitive thing, because even though I was growing up in a developing country, and I'm now in a first world nation, I sometimes think that the focus on education, at least on STEM education, was greater there than I see it here today. And it's something that I think the United States needs to fix. It needs to fix fairly quickly, especially as the world keeps evolving. If AI is going to be such a big part of our new world, you need to have a broader workforce that is not scared of math, right? And that seems to be kind of one of liberal education does a lot of very good things. One of the bad things about liberal education is this de-emphasis on math and on sciences. And I think that needs to be.
But you don't think this is at a stage where, well, once the automobile was invented, there was no point learning horse riding. So you don't think we are at that stage where, given what's happening with artificial intelligence and augmenting intelligence with various tools, that this is not going to become like horse riding?
Well, actually, I think it's worse than that, right? Because if you're not now at this point in time someone that is data savvy or math savvy and trained in math, then you're going to become a casualty, because the jobs that are actually going to start getting impacted are the ones where it was replaceable by an algorithm. So you are much rather be the person who's writing the algorithm, or at least working on the algorithm, rather than being on the casualty side.
All right. We are close to the end. This is the second last thing. This is a section called On the Spot. I'm going to ask you a bunch of quick questions. Whatever comes to your mind is the right answer. What's your favorite cuisine?
Asian food, all kinds.
If you could go invite an historical figure for dinner, who would you invite and what would you talk about?
So I've been reading a biography of the Roosevelts. I would love to go to dinner with FDR. I find all that he did in the build up to World War II and then during World War II just fascinating.
What is the achievement that you're most proud of?
I think, personally, being a parent and personally being someone that is, bringing up two kids. But business-wise, I think it's getting the business to a point where we didn't think it was possible back when we were starting it.
And with your kids, are you able to get them interested in STEM?
Well, yes and no, right? Yes, but then they also
You
let's
want to
just
do
say that
both.
they think of me as the math parent.
Right. If you suddenly find yourself with a free afternoon, let's say a big client meeting or conference was supposed to happen and it got canceled last minute, how do you spend it?
I would love to do something that's sports related, something outdoors. I play tennis. I've just taken up bike riding, so something outdoors for sure.
We got to play tennis. I love playing tennis. That's why I moved to Florida. Every day outdoors is great. Last question, Vivek. What is brand Vivek Jetley in your own words?
Okay, so it's taken me a while to think this through. So I'm going to bring it down to some key phrases or key words. Number one, intellectually curious. Two, biased for growth. And three, someone that's very focused on building teams.
There you have it, friends. The brand today, Vivek Jetley, the tall guy in analytics who's intellectually curious, loves to build sustainably, and has a growth bias. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you, Sandeep. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.